Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Leaders from China, Japan and South Korea have had their first trilateral meeting in Seoul in more than 4 years. Chinese Premier Li Qiang has called the meeting as both a restart and a new beginning. What's behind the resumption of the trilateral meeting and how significant was it for the three countries and the region? What will a trilateral free trade agreement be like as the three countries resume negotiations? And finally, what are the challenges facing the three neighbors in an increasingly divided and competitive world? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining us for today's show are Professor Zha Daojiong from Peking University, Professor Robert Kelly from Pusan National University, and our correspondents Terrance Terashima in Tokyo and Sumin Yoo in Seoul. So welcome to Dialogue. I will start with Sumin. Since you are in Seoul, where the trilateral meeting happened, so tell us what's your takeaway?
Well, this year marks the 25th anniversary of trilateral cooperation among the three countries and also the resumption of trilateral talks after almost 4.5-year hiatus. So just like Kim Tae-ho, the first deputy director of the South Korean National Security Office, had put it, this summit, to many people, including myself, was seen as sort of an inflection point or a turning point for the three countries, or restoration or quote-unquote normalization of the trilateral cooperation system. Now, as the leaders work to restore ties among the three countries, much of the discussion focused on economic relations, civil cooperation, trade, industry collaboration, and supply chain dynamics. So not really going in-depth into talking about sensitive issues like the DPRK's denuclearization or the Fukushima water discharge issue. Well, the three agreed to strengthen cooperation on some critical issues such as climate change, artificial intelligence, new infectious diseases, and also on addressing low birth rates and aging population. So again, as you could see, all the agendas they've all been trying to cope with to address shared challenges. So they're basically starting with some lighter but some practical cooperation to revitalize the momentum among the three countries. Now, on the bilateral China-Korea bilateral relations front, as I've been covering China-South Korea bilateral ties for the past few years, I was sort of pleasantly surprised by the establishment of the China-Korea 2+2 diplomatic and security dialogue. Now, this 2+2 diplomatic and security dialogue is particularly seen as an opportunity to mend bilateral relations that were practically strained by the COVID-19 pandemic and also the broader China-U.S. rivalry. So experts indicate that this signals a commitment to comprehensive security discussions, which will ultimately contribute to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Well, now lastly, the fact that the three leaders reaffirmed their commitment to holding regular trilateral summits and some ministerial meetings is meaningful. The renewed engagement basically holds promise for continued dialogue and collaboration, and also institutionalizing these trilateral cooperation is really essential for promoting peace, stability, and prosperity in Northeast Asia and more broadly to the Indo-Pacific region, of course.
Well, thank you, Sumi. And also, Terrance, if you look at the summit meeting, I know you have followed closely, despite that you are being in Tokyo. Tell us, what are the points that impressed you the most?
Well, as Sumi said, this is trying to re-establish the trilateral cooperation. And since 4.5 years ago, the geopolitical situation, the state of the global economy has changed. So the trilateral the three countries have a renewed challenges that they need to go through. And it is important, significant for Japan to re-establish this three-way cooperations. And still, it is an early stage yet. But as these talks move on, next one is in Tokyo, and as these talks continue, officials said they're hoping that these framework, the FTA, economic cooperations will expand to, such as utilizing the regional comprehensive economic partnership, investment in ASEAN, joint investment in ASEAN and third country as well, and establishing the stable economic rim in this region is quite beneficial for Japan at the moment facing the challenges for the economic recovery. But of course there are still a lot of details to discuss, not only the sort of environment and nursing care and etc., but there are a lot of topics to discuss, as well as hurdles to clear for things to move further, and there are people watching closely for the development for these renewed trilateral relations between South Korea, Japan, and China.
And China, right. Assuming, for China-South Korea relationship, we know there's a free trade deal. They're now talking about accelerating the negotiation for the second phase of this FTA. Tell us more about that.
Sure. So as you said, working level negotiations for the second phase of the Korea-China Free Trade Agreement are set to resume after a hiatus of 8 years since 2015. Now, that was decided during the China-ROK summit yesterday, the two finally being on the same page to resume the second phase of the FTA negotiations. So with this, both countries will explore some ways to expand market access beyond the product trade sector, which was part of the first phase of the FTA talks. Now, the FTA has been primarily focused on the product sector in the first phase, but this discussion will now extend to the service sector, encompassing culture, tourism, and the legal domain. And this move essentially aims to foster greater exchanges and openness beyond the existing market access in the product trade sector. So with the resumption of the second phase of the FTA negotiations, expectations are pretty high among South Koreans for a full-fledged return of Chinese tourists. And also there is this interest in whether South Korea's trade deficit with China will turn into a surplus. And of course, the two sides plan to dive right into the discussions because they plan to convene a meeting of senior representatives for the FTA in early June. So from next week straight away, essentially reinvigorating the momentum for follow-up discussions on the China-Korea FTA. And also, as next year marks the 10th anniversary of the China-Korea Free Trade Agreement discussions, both nations apparently want to draw some concrete solutions, concrete results before that. So it seems like they will really work to expedite the FTA negotiation process.
Yeah, it's really quick. Early June next week, we'll start the negotiation. But picking up of what Terrance has said about the hurdles of reaching that kind of like ideal cooperation and agreeing with each other, given the differences between these countries. Terrance, tell us more about what do you see are obstacles, the challenges ahead for the three countries here.
Yes, although the three countries want to secure and strengthen the cooperation, there are still lingering hurdles that they need to clear, like the historical, the territorial issues, which has slowed the negotiation, economic cooperations in the past, and also regional security issues. Japan and South Korea relations has begun to thaw after President Yoon took office in 2022. Yet there's still a step-by-step dialogue is required. Both countries said they're going to increase dialogue, and officials here in Japan are talking with the Chinese official, hoping to increase the dialogue as well. And without clearing some of these hurdles, and with in-depth talk for the economic cooperation is still a long way off, and especially recently, Japan started to release last year in August, release contaminated water from the crippled Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in the Pacific Oceans, and China imposed an import ban on seafood products from Japan, and this was also discussed in a bilateral between Kishida and Li, but expert here said this issue needs to be resolved, but will continue to wedge the dialogue between China and Japan as well. So hoping that experts here, they're hoping that the trilateral dialogue as well as the bilateral dialogue with China, Japan, South Korea is going to solve some of these issues before moving on to the economic strengthening economic cooperations and going into more details.
Well, thank you, Sumin. Thank you, Terrance. Thank you for joining us. And let's turn to our guest, Professor Robert Galli and Professor Zha. So Robert, I will start with you here. If you look at the meeting, more than 4 years, of course, we know there's a pandemic, but a lot happened over the past 4 years. So what brought these three countries together again, having this trilateral summit meeting?
Sure, I think it's primarily their economic interrelationship, which is pretty thick and pretty dense, but has come into question because of the strategic competition that's arising in the region between the United States and China. And of course, South Korea and Japan are both U.S. allies, and I think that's the real driver here, right? Is that the two countries, the South Korea and Japan, are economically quite interwoven with China, but they're allies, the United States. And as China and the United States pull apart, it increasingly puts countries like Korea and Japan in the middle, and they're just not quite sure what to do. I mean, they really don't know, right? A delinking, which is sort of, one of the terms that you hear thrown around a lot about these relationships, would be quite expensive for South Korea and Japan, right? China's a larger economy and could carry it more easily, but all three economies would suffer if they did that. But that's sort of where the Americans and the Chinese are going, right? The Biden administration has really emphasized supply chain relocation, right? The Americans are putting tariffs on Chinese goods, presumably the Chinese will respond in kind. And I think that's what's really going on here, right? Is that there's this strategic competition in the background that's subverting, undercutting China's relationship with a lot of the countries around it, the U.S. allies around it. And all those allies are trying to figure out what to do because they don't just want a hard break. Right? A hard break would be really expensive for everybody. And so they're trying to feel their way through. And I think that's what this is.
Yeah, if this, Professor Zha, if this is for, the consideration on the side of Japan and South Korea, what about China? What's the consideration behind China's agreeing to hold such a trilateral meetings here?
I do not know everything about the negotiations, but given what I've heard, the meeting was actually initiated by all different sides. Supposed to be taking place earlier in the year, but due to a number of considerations. I would think the timing has to do with two factors. One is obviously for China, the core issue is Taiwan. And after the inauguration of the leader in Taiwan, then the Japanese and South Korean government reaction was considered acceptable. There were a different set of reactions from Tokyo, so I don't think the meeting would have taken place. And secondly, I would think there are some real questions for all three governments. For example, China has given visa-free policies, unilateral visa-free policies to a number of countries in Europe, in Southeast Asia, but somehow among the three, China, Japan, and Korea, they can't do that. And I do believe governments of the three face the question, what are you really doing with your geographic neighbors? That's how I read the sentiments behind the scheduling of the meeting as of this point of time.
Well, with that in mind, Robert, if you look at the results, well, there's no big plans for doing what is going to be done next stage. But there are some concrete, let's say, progress, the efforts or agreement to institutionalize this trilateral summit meeting, to have more regular meetings among the leaders and also among the ministers from the three countries. And also they talked about this trilateral free trade deal. So they are, all of them are part of this RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Cooperation partnership in this region. So probably it's easier for them to accelerate or to boost this trilateral free trade agreement, let's say. If you look at this, do you think this is a meeting that is significant probably to stabilize or to bring them together, at least economically and in terms of trade?
I think the trade relationship has probably reached the peak of where it can go, because I think the strategic issues will undercut that. And this is something I've emphasized on your program in the past too. I think the strategic issues have tumble-down effects, if you will, on all the other big issues out here: finance, banking, North Korea, sanctions, environment, climate change, and trade, right? I really think the core issue is that the United States and China are drifting apart, and U.S. allies in the region are going to start to face choices. They're going to start to face forks that are going to be pretty uncomfortable, because a lot of them, not just South Korea and Japan, but Australia, the Philippines, Vietnam, all of them have thick trade relationships with China, and those are going to come into question as the political relationship between the U.S. and China sours. And only if that is fixed or repaired, and I think everyone has a collective interest in that occurring, by the way, but only if that happens will any kind of deeper integration continue. So I would argue, for example, that RCEP probably will not come to much fruition. I would be very, very surprised with a free trade area between South Korea, Japan, and China. Economically, collectively, sure, it will be excellent for all three partners, but I think the politics of it are quite honestly, are just really, really difficult at this time. So my guess is that we're kind of at the peak of where we can go, unless there's a real turnaround in the relationship between the Americans and the Chinese.
So, Professor Zha, this is questions for you. How do you look at this China-U.S. relationship? We had just concluded a meeting on tourism between China and the U.S. in the western Chinese city in Xi'an. And of course, since the two leaders meeting last year in San Francisco, we are seeing more regular, let's say, visits by senior officials from both countries. So, how much does the China-U.S. relationship to do with the current, say, relationship among the three regional countries here?
Well, it's a matter of perspective. It's very useful to remember that the trilateral meeting began in 1999 in the wake of the Asian financial crisis, and Chinese, Japanese, the relationship among China, Japan, and South Korea had been historically complex, but the Asian financial crisis provided a larger regional background, or let's say political convenience, for the setup of the framework. And the framework never really got canceled out, but over the years there have been a number of issues and others. I would think the meeting or resumption, continuation, I would rather argue, of the three-way meeting is in some ways a demonstration to say, for each of the three, there is still a good deal of resilience. There are, let's say, in the relationships, there is also the truly regional issues among the three to deal with. Is the U.S. as a factor? Yes. But is it a, let's say, predeterministic factor? I very much doubt it. I think it's a matter of perspective. After all, if you look at issues like aging, issues like tourism, or if you look at even regional pollutions, or the traditional list of, let's say, cooperation among China, Japan, Korea, the U.S. cannot really do that much. The U.S. may have a role to play in, let's say, the semiconductor sector, but to what extent this will be, going down the road. In other words, I think, again, I go back to the point to question ourselves whether or not, let's say, here in China, over there in Seoul or in Tokyo, the queue quote unquote, has to come from Washington, D.C. before they conduct such diplomacy among themselves.
Robert, as Professor Zha has said, as long as Washington is sure, Seoul and Tokyo is strategically aligned with the U.S. in terms of security and diplomacy, for example, and for trade cooperation, economic cooperation with China on issues in particular like aging population, low birth rate, climate change. Do you see there's any intention of, let's say, interference from Washington?
No, I think the United States actually would like to prevent the U.S. and China sliding or tumbling into a Cold War. I actually don't think that that is America's goal. I think we would like that, and to the extent that regional partnerships can help sort of pull China into local mechanisms and institutions and rules, I think we would actually like that. So I think the United States probably supports the idea of South Korea and Japan talking more to China. And I would argue that there's only so far the U.S. can actually push South Korea and Japan because they have to live next to China. This is something that I emphasize a lot to my American audiences when I talk about this, is that, South Korea and Japan are right next door to China, and there's only so far the United States can push them. They're always going to have a relationship with China, at least a social relationship, if not an economic one. Like I said, a hard break would be very, very difficult for both countries. And so it's not like we're going to have sort of like some major thing tomorrow, unless Taiwan blows up or something like that, right? So there will be efforts by South Korea and Japan, I think, to keep the relationship on the road, to prevent some kind of like major bipolar Cold War division or something like that. There's a lot of interest, I think, in that out here. But as long as the strategic relationship at the top, like I said, is sort of coming apart, that's going to put that's going to put a great deal of informal pressure. It's going to put limits, if you will, on how far U.S. allies can go. So, for example, China used to be South Korea's biggest trading partner until I think last year, and now it's the United States again, right? Because we don't know, but probably because the Americans and South Korean conservatives have been saying we need to start shifting away. I mean, this is a big topic of debate here in South Korea, right? How far does it want to de-link with China? Is it willing to carry the economic costs for that? But that's the future. And I think China, to be honest, I think China could actually do something on this. I think China was a little bit more conciliatory towards Japan and on Taiwan, I think the relationship would be a little bit easier, quite honestly. But barring some kind of breakthrough on the political issues, the local territorial issues, the larger strategic issues and stuff like that, I would be surprised if you got deeper trade relations, because that pulls these countries even closer to China, which is exactly what's created the tension to begin with.
So Robert, how far they will go, for example, in terms of this trilateral free trade deal, it's really up to the will of the three capitals?
I think you can probably get some technocratic agreements on some sub-political issues, things that don't activate voters very much. So, for example, if you look at the things that people were talking about that there was some agreement on, it was minor stuff like health and climate change that are pretty complicated. A lot of people aren't going to know about, but you're not going to get a great deal of agreement on any kind of like really high-profile issue, any kind of strategic issues. For example, North Korean sanctions, as far as I can tell, weren't mentioned at all, which is a really core issue among the three states. Right. So, yeah, I mean, you can get things like tourism and people to people and students. Here in South Korea, we have a lot of Chinese students. It's great. I teach them all the time. But, that's all kind of light, right? I mean, that's sort of low politics. If you want to get to like real breakthrough issues, right, that's going to involve these larger strategic issues, North Korea, Taiwan and stuff like that, the stationing of U.S. forces out here, Chinese force posture, all that stuff wasn't discussed, right? And that's going to, like I said, I think that's going to put a hard brake on just how far the economic relationship can go. For example, a free trade deal, I would be shocked if a free trade deal happened, because that has major strategic implications too, because it really opens up South Korea and Japan to Chinese economic penetration, which has become really, really controversial here. So, should we do it? Economically, the arguments are pretty clear, right? Yes, but politically, I would be shocked. Conservatives in South Korea and Japan will never vote for that. They won't support it.
Professor Zha, how do you look at that? Of course, we are seeing like advanced chips industry, for example, basically pressure from Washington on Japan, on South Korea. They are producing, let's say, the kind of consequence. So you are seeing, the manufacturers are shifting away from China in terms of supply chain, industrial chain. Will that kind of trend continue into, in particular, other areas? And so how do you look at that?
The CJK free trade idea has been in place for a while. And whether or not we make a lot of progress or actually get one, it's probably not that consequential. Many economies don't have free trade agreements, but they are quite well integrated in terms of the industry penetration, in terms of mutual investment or trade. We shouldn't overemphasize the let's say geopolitical significance. What's really going on in this part of the world, first between Japan and China, now South Korea and China, what you have is a gradual shift towards what's called horizontal competition. In other words, more and more companies, and of course this differs from industry to industry, are now reaching at comparable levels of competitiveness, both in terms of technological sophistication and also in terms of generating their own international supply lines. It's not as vertical as it was before. I do believe in South Korea they have an index constantly tracking the speed of some Chinese technology or technologies or services that may be viewed as competitive or replacing South Korean ones. What I'm really trying to say is that more important than the free trade agreements is the implicit or what's called non-tariff barriers or technical issues like standards that often don't get reflected in these agreements and these moving targets. Let's say setting a time moving into 0% of the tariffs. And the really challenge here is for companies are two. One is that whether or not government negotiated agreements reflect their strategic plans. If they don't, probably even with an agreement in place, they're not going to utilize the agreement as much. And secondly, it's whether or not they really, how far they go with this seemingly neat geostrategic choice of one market versus another. After all, you will have economic geographies, the dictates of economic geography at work, although some can argue in the age of digital trading, in the age of further reduction of rates of shipping, that's a lesser of a factor. But at the end of the day, I do believe we can't. The three economies will have to figure out a comfort level of mutual integration to the extent that's required. And if I mention one more quick point.
Yeah, please.
I was in Seoul 2 weeks ago, and for example, I heard that South Korean government is organizing its own forum, government-to-government forum with the African continent. And if you see that, well, lots of things are happening, and you see similar trajectories at different stages of economic diplomacy. What I'm really trying to get at here, yes, the U.S. is important. Yes, the U.S. has preferences, and the U.S. is clearly articulating that. But in the end, foreign policy has to factor in a more broad set of considerations.
Well, ultimately, it's a trade, it's economy. Well, on that note, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.